Hello, everyone. I'm Russ of Aquarimax, and this is Peter of Bugs in Cyberspace. And today, we're going to talk to you about the Orchid Mantis. Is it the best pet invertebrate? Well, today we'll talk about housing and care. We'll talk about the pros and cons of keeping this species so that you can come to your own conclusion. Well, welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel today.
I'm really grateful to be here, Russ. I've been following your channel for a long time, and we've known each other besides. And so it's a real honor for me to be here and to show your viewers the Orchid Mantis.
Well, it's an honor for me as well. I've been really looking forward to this. So thanks again for joining in. So what can you tell us, just kind of a general intro to the Orchid Mantis, a little bit about its name, where it's from, and so on?
The scientific name is Hymenopus coronatus, and they occur in Southeast Asia. That's a very broad region. I think the majority of them probably come out, the ones that come into the hobby, probably come from Malaysia or maybe Thailand. But they go down into Indonesia and the archipelago there. Pretty widespread species, although I think they're in Singapore too, actually. I've talked to people who said they've never seen one there, but you know, they'll live in the trees, and you know, unless you're out there looking for them and probably lucky, you might never see one. They're called Orchid Mantises, although recently I think the name Kung Fu Mantis has been gaining some favor, which I don't like as much as I like Orchid Mantis, but that's probably just because, you know, you and I grew up knowing them as Orchid Mantises. Right. But there's a BBC Earth video that's out there with David Attenborough narrating, and it's titled Kung Fu Mantis versus Spider or something like that. And so now, just in the last couple of years since that video has been out, people have been contacting me and asking me, and I didn't know what they were talking about at first, do you have any Kung Fu Mantises? But they are more popularly known as Orchid Mantises.
Okay.
And I'll say one thing also about the name Orchid Mantis. It's not really any better than Kung Fu Mantis because they don't. It's sort of a myth that they even hang out on orchids themselves. Really? Yeah, which a lot of people don't know. Even lots of mainstream hobbyists still think they look the way they do because they evolved to mimic orchids. But apparently that's not actually the case.
Interesting. So is it that, what is their evolutionary reason for looking at it?
I don't really know. I suspect it's white flowers of some kind, or probably not bird droppings, because they're just way prettier than all the bird mimicking insects that are out there. Sure. Sometimes too, it's sort of a cryptic coloration thing where maybe you have, you know, like the leaves behind me. The sun's not showing on them anymore, but when the light comes through them in a particular way, it can confuse predators. You know, when there's light coming through a little bit, and maybe their coloration has something to do with that. I'm not really sure.
Okay, so it could kind of mimic a dappled area where there's sunlight and shade coming together, something like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that makes sense. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Well,
yeah, it's a very common myth.
Okay. Well, I learned something already, and we've just started, so I'm excited. Well, let's talk a little bit about housing, about their enclosures, substrates, that kind of thing.
I have a container here, and I'll try to hold it up so you all can see it. It's got a lid that goes up on top of it here as well, and the mantis is actually in that cup right now. But this is a 32-ounce deli cup. It's a size that I really like for the majority of the Orchid Mantis's lifespan. And one of the reasons for that, we often actually start them out in smaller cups like this here, or like this, and not necessarily even with any substrate on them. They have this little bit of paper towel square that we have glue gunned up there to the lid. And when the small ones are in containers like this, they're actually a lot closer to their food. And mantises like these tend to be ambush predators. And so they're not necessarily going to chase after their food. A lot of times people will email me and say, I have a 10-gallon tank, and you know, can I can I put my mantis in there? Yeah, they had some other pet in there at one time, and they just, they want to reuse this empty tank that they have. But it's too large. The mantises will often not chase their prey down, and so they'll wait for it to come there. And if you have a tiny mantis and in a 10-gallon tank and you're feeding it fruit flies because that's what's appropriate for a mantis that size, you're not really going to know in a tank that size unless you stay there and watch the whole time, which could take hours for the fruit fly to make its way up to where the young mantis is. You're not going to know whether it was eaten or not, because it could escape. There's only two things that can happen. It can either like disappear, get out, or get into the mantis's stomach. And unless you're watching, you're not going to know. Whereas in a small cup like this, the fruit fly will tend to crawl right near where the mantis is pretty quickly because it's so small and the fruit flies are active. And the mantis will just grab it right away, and you'll know that your job, as a pet keeper is done because the mantis is happily chewing away on a living housefly or fruit fly. Yeah. So we will sort of graduate them up to slightly larger cups on the basis of what size the nymph is. When they hatch out, they could easily rest on my pinky nail. They're so small, but they'll shed their skin every couple of weeks or every month or two, a little bit longer as they get older in between molts. And as they grow, we move them into larger cups. And the reason for the larger cups is because unlike so many of the other pet bugs that we keep, they actually need to hang from something like this orchid flower here to shed their skin, because they use gravity to kind of, with their own weight, pull themselves out of their old skin. They just kind of fall out of it a little bit. And if there's not enough room, if there's not enough height in the cup, they could bump their heads on the bottom, kind of get stuck in that molt, their old skin. And that could be really dangerous for them if they don't exit it properly. So generally we'll say that the height of the container, more important than the width for mantises, needs to be about 3 times the length of the mantis. And in addition to that, we need some molting perches in here. I actually like these other lids right here. We glue these things onto the bottom of these lids here just to add a little bit more texture so that the mantis can hook all of its little feet in there, and then they'll molt straight down. Maybe you've seen spiders do that as well. So, substrate, we've got the substrate down here in the bottom. Doesn't really matter what kind of substrate you use. I tend to use coconut fiber just because it's really cheap, it's really clean, it doesn't tend to mold. The point of the substrate in the bottom of the cup, it does sort of mask seeing the frass or the mantis droppings down in the bottom, but the main function of it is to maintain humidity in the cage, because that molting process is a really delicate, sensitive time for them. And if it's too dry in there, they will get stuck in their molts.
Right. And I've noticed with some of the less tropical mantises without a substrate, as long as they get regularly misted, they're usually okay. But with an orchid mantis, which is more tropical, and I imagine maintaining a more constant humidity is more important.
It's really the orchid mantises and their care, despite them being very exotic looking, a lot of people are intimidated by getting one or some of the flashier or more exotic looking mantises. But by and large, the species that are available in the hobby are all sort of uniformly similar in care needs. And that's sort of the reason why they're available in the hobby, is because people have been able to, without too much trouble, reproduce them.
Okay.
So yeah, orchids are a little bit more difficult to reproduce than a lot of other mantises. But in terms of their humidity requirements, I would say that all of the commonly available ones in the hobby have pretty similar humidity needs.
Okay, good to know. So when you mentioned keeping them in the smaller deli cups without substrate, you just rely on misting and keeping maybe some of that paper towel in there a little bit damp?
Yeah.
And that's sufficient?
Yeah, no two containers are quite alike. And you know this from keeping isopods, of course. If I put 10 holes in the lid of this cup it's going to be a whole different kind of humidity situation than if I only have 2 holes in the lid. And if I dribble 2 droplets of water on this piece of paper here to saturate it, that's going to be different than if I do 3 and 1 drips down into the bottom, you know. So every container that pet keepers out there have is a little different than the other person's. And the temperature of the home can sometimes affect how quickly things evaporate in conjunction with the ventilation in that particular tank and how much humidity is being added. So it's sometimes, as you know from keeping isopods and talking to people about isopods too, it's sometimes difficult to give a one-size-fits-all solution. You kind of have to play with what you have in terms of a tank to get things just right sometimes.
That makes a lot of sense. And since you're in Oregon, where the humidity is just ambientally higher than it is where I am, then you would probably need to provide less supplemental humidity than I would.
Yeah, it really, you know, as pet keepers, of course, our goal is always to sort of mimic what they need. You know, what's the natural habitat. But you know, this right here is a much different habitat now because I put the lid on than my home is. And so we're working on the microclimate here in this tank, you know, and, you know, just kind of like, I don't even really think about because, you know, in the summertime, it is a little different here than it is in the wintertime, for example, and it rains here all the time. So there is a lot of humidity around, but, you know, I mean, I'm always just looking at the tank itself and, you know, thinking, you know, what does this mantis need? Is it moist enough in there for it? And, you know, making adjustments on the basis of, you know, the cup.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I noticed the decor in there, you have some, what looks like plastic orchid flowers in there.
Yeah, there's some flowers, just fake flowers in this case. And besides that, the only other thing that I have in there is the substrate and then that little molting platform that we glue gun to the lid here. Really, this is all they need. You can get as elaborate as you want to. And of course, a beautiful planted tank, like I see in the background of your videos frequently, those always really do a lot to highlight what's beautiful about the animal if they're done right. But by not having too much going on when you're a new mantis keeper, you know, keeping the variables to a minimum, keeping things simple, you can really sort of fine tune your care regimen on that basis once you start, you know, using a planted tank and stuff like that, maybe a grow light on top or whatever. Things can become a little bit more complicated because, you know, there aren't care sheets written for your specific tank necessarily.
Right. So master the basics first and kind of get your feet wet, and then you can look into some of the more complicated setups. That's a
good way to go.
Okay. So what is the temperature range that orchid mantises require? Where do they do best?
Let's see if I pop this up here a little bit. Room temperature is usually what I advise. And the reason for that is because once people start putting heat pads or using heat lamps, things like that, everything else can become a little bit more complicated too. If you put a heat lamp on top of, you know, a wire mesh cage or something, that's going to make it warmer, and that's actually better for the mantis because they will grow more quickly. They'll eat more frequently when they're warm. They'll grow more quickly. They'll be more robust, stronger, healthier mantises. But you really have to be careful with adding heat to the mantises because if things get too dry, and we all get busy, you know, you don't look at your pet for a couple days, but your light maybe is on a timer or something that's going on and off, you know, every day. It can get dry in there very quickly. And until you sort of get used to what your cage is doing, you have to be really careful not to let them dry out, because the most common cause of death in mantises for new keepers is mismolting. And a mismolt is when they do get stuck in their skin, maybe because there wasn't enough humidity in there for them to, you know, gracefully slip out of it.
Right. Yeah, I remember I had a golden Asian mantis that I purchased from you. I think it was a couple of summers ago. And it was doing really well, growing and everything. And then one evening, I neglected to molt it or missed it at the right time. The next day, it had a mismolt. Didn't die, but both of its raptorial forelegs were a little bit deformed from its improper molt, and I had to hand feed it for the next 3 weeks or so until it molted again, and then it was fine after that.
Oh, wow. You got lucky there.
Yeah, I remember actually watching a video that you had posted right around that same time, a little bit before that, showing the hand feeding of a mantis that had mismolted. So I tried your technique and was able to get it to molt and do well and reach adulthood. So
that's really great. A lot of times it's not a happy ending. So
right.
Once they get stuck in their molt and part of them is in it still and part of them is out, they start hardening as soon as the air hits that new layer of skin. And however their new skin hardens, they'll be stuck in that position. And if it's just one leg or maybe two legs, it's not usually a big deal. The front legs are really important, of course. It's worth mentioning here that mantises are capable of regenerating their limbs. They can lose one entirely, and through a molt or two, regenerate it, maybe a stub after the first molt, and then entirely on the second molt. A little trickier when they're up front, the four legs, where what they use to capture their prey.
Right. It was certainly kind of tedious to hand feed it and kind of chain feed bugs through. While I was waiting for it to molt, but it was
a labor of love.
Right. It was worth it to see the mantis recover. So
yeah,
definitely. Well, cool. I think what would you say the minimum room temperature would be if my house reaches, say, 62 degrees in the winter routinely? Is that too cool, or is it just going to slow it down?
What temperature did you say? 62?
62.
That really is too cold. You do want them to be around 80 ideally. Now they can get down to 40 degrees and they won't die. It will just pretty much shut down their metabolism though. They'll still feed, but they just won't grow. And it actually, if they can't digest their food properly when they're cold like that, that could lead to health issues too. So 62 is probably about as low as you want to go as a consistent temperature. I would recommend trying to achieve 80, but again, you really have to be very careful with keeping them at those optimal temperatures for the reasons that we discussed earlier. It's worth figuring it out. And targeting 80 as a good daytime temperature, and then flip the light off at night. You can go warmer than that, and of course you can go cooler than that, but they're just not going to grow at the same rate the cooler you keep them. But they're not going to. They're very hardy, really. You can drop them down to 50 degrees for a week. For example, if you were going on vacation, if I leave for a week, I turn all of my heating elements off because I want everything to kind of slow down, and I won't be there to mist them as frequently. But it will also slow their metabolism down so they don't need to feed every few days. And that's one of the things about mantises compared with other pet bugs, is they really do need a lot more attention than tarantulas or isopods or millipedes, where you can go away for a week or two or even a month if the container is really set up and you dump a bunch of leaves in with the isopods and stuff,
Right.
And there isn't a lot of ventilation with mantises. Because they are hanging from something to molt, you do need to check them frequently compared to other pet bugs to make sure that the container has the right humidity, that it's not too humid that water vapor is on the side of the tank, because then things will start to mold in there, and that can foul the air, and that can be unhealthy if mold is forming in the container. So you need to have enough ventilation for that as well.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you ever use springtails as a bioactive mold control? I
don't personally. A lot of people do, and I think, like I said about having a beautiful tank, with a planted tank, it accentuates the beauty of the animal. Having a bioactive vivarium's that same sort of thing. It makes the whole tank more interesting when you have other little crawling things around. Anybody who's going to enjoy having a pet insect, a planted tank, a miniature version of nature in the house, should also enjoy seeing lots of other little things crawling around in there. And if they're beneficial to that container, in terms of the cleanup duties, then all the better.
Right. No, that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about feeding. I know that my wife is actually really interested in getting an orchid mantis, has been interested in them, but I think feeding might be a sticking point for her based on what it needs to eat. But let's talk about feeding a little bit.
Yeah. So it depends on the size of the mantis. I'll pop this mantis up here. You guys can take a closer look at it. This is the orchid mantis. Right there.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Yeah, yeah.
And this one here, you can see in relation to my finger, I would tend to feed one this size with houseflies. Now, typically when you buy them, they're not quite this big yet. And so people would start them off with fruit flies. And since mantises only tend to live about a year, when you get them young, you're going to have this pet for a longer time. If you get an adult mantis, everybody wants the big ones. They want a big mantis that's going to, grab the adult cricket crawling across the bottom of the cage. And they want to watch that. Same thing with tarantula keepers. That's when they're enjoying their pet the most, is when it's grabbing the prey and eating.
Right.
It's like watching a nature documentary at home. So typically we'll start them off with fruit flies. Most baby mantises, when they first hatch out of the egg case, they will be feeding on Drosophila melanogaster fruit flies, the smallest ones, the ones without wings. We'll graduate them up to the Drosophila haidi after that, and then up to house flies. There are a lot of people who don't want to purchase those feeders online on a regular basis for their mantises, because it can be a little bit expensive. Fruit fly culture might cost, $10 or something. And the house flies, with shipping, it starts to add up a little bit. So some people will get small mealworms from the pet store, or small crickets if they happen to have a good reptile type of pet store that offers smaller feeders. Or other people might go out to their porch light at night and find some bugs flying around there. Some different views on whether to use wild-caught feeders or not, but I've done it my whole life and never noticed any issues. And sometimes, if I have a really important mantis, I'll give it a nice big juicy moth from outside, because I think it tends to be a little bit healthier for a mantis than a feeder that's been captive bred. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much it for the different sizes of feeders. Of course, they have those raptorial forelegs, and if any bug comes crawling past them and they're hungry, they will just grab it. And the orchid mantises, pop it on the orchid here. So many different kinds of predatory insects do mimic flowers. Can you see that there?
Yeah, yeah.
Because my screen is only this big, so I don't know how well you can see. So many different things will mimic flowers. Stick insects mimic sticks, leaf insects, leaves, and stuff like that. So these are ambush predators, and so they'll wait on the flower, often for a pollinator or some kind of flying insect to come along, and then they'll use their mimicry, and they'll just grab that prey insect and eat it alive, of course. I do have a fly over here, and if we're lucky, I might be able to get it to snap up a fly. It's always a little bit tricky to do, in the moment on live camera, but I could try if you'd like me to.
Oh yeah. That would be a lot of fun, actually.
Okay. I have them here on some ice, and so they will be perhaps a little bit less inclined to fly. Come up here. Oh, that one flew away already. It's down here on my computer.
When it was sitting on the flower, that was fantastic. As soon as it stopped moving, it was blending in with the little shadows and the petals and everything. It was awesome.
Yeah, they'll often have pinks, shades of pink in them, a little bit of green. The females have a green collar, whereas the males will have a brownish collar. And so I'm going to put it in here in this nice small container with that fly. And are you able to see that okay? Oh, there's another fly that's just the one that escaped from me. It's just about to crawl over the camera lens. Can you see that?
Oh, I think I just, yep, there it was.
It's still a little bit cold, and so its flight muscles are temporarily deactivated. But this one here, I'm actually going to cheat a little bit and turn this so that the mantis is a little bit closer to the fly.
It's a little bit backlit from the window, but I can kind of see it. That's a little better there.
There
Yeah, we saw it.
There it is. There it is.
Oh, perfect.
So now that fly is not going to fly away again, I can pop this back out here so you guys
you can get a close look at it munching.
Yeah.
Oh, that is great.
That in focus.
It's kind of going in and out.
Mm-hmm.
That's better right there. Yeah, that's good. Love it.
So it'll chow that down. You can see that the abdomen of this mantis is a bit thin. I brought a hungry one up here on purpose, hoping that we might be able to do what we just did there.
Yeah, that turned out really nicely.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I get a lot is how often should I feed my mantis? And like the caging question, it's a really difficult one to answer because it really depends on the size of the mantis, which, you know, people don't often mention when they're asking the question, what size their mantis is. And, you know, what the size of the feeder insect is. That really affects how often you need to feed them too. And so what I generally tell people is to look at the thickness of the abdomen, the plumpness of the abdomen, and use that as a gauge for whether your mantis needs to eat or not.
Okay.
You know, a mantis will rarely refuse food. They will just keep eating and eating. There's another myth in the hobby that says that a mantis will eat to the point that it explodes. That's not true. But it is good to remove any uneaten feeders from your mantis's cage. If they're not eating them, that fly could potentially fly up and knock a molting mantis down, for example. And a hungry mantis won't typically ever molt, whereas a plump mantis is much more likely to say, hey, this is the time, I've got all this energy stored up here, I'm gonna go for it. And if you have crickets in the cage and your mantis is molting, the crickets might come up and eat the molting mantis while it's defenseless. Same thing with roaches. And so you really want to remove those uneaten feeders for that reason. Same thing with tarantulas.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I once lost a young mantis because it was trying to molt and there were too many fruit flies in the enclosure. Mm-hmm. And I think they bothered it while it was molting.
Yeah, and you know, when you have a ton of mantises like I often do, you know, I'll feed 100 of them all at once. And then I go back to them a few hours later and check to see if all of the ones that I fed, because they do eat very quickly. They don't mess around, especially when they're in a small container this size. You know, it's all business in there. So you come back a little bit later, check on it, and if some of them aren't eating and they look plump, then I pull the fruit flies out, and you know, and then often the mantis will molt shortly after that. So you want to, that's a good time to, you know, add a little moisture in there too. If you see a mantis that's not eating, that could be a sign of an upcoming molt.
Okay, so that kind of helps you keep a handle on proper hydration as well.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So is there any other maintenance that we should be aware of? How frequently you need to clean the enclosure? Is that more something that you notice that it's starting to look dirty? Is it more something that you're graduating the containers out frequently enough you don't have to worry about that as much? Or
Mantises, it depends on your tank a little bit. If it's a small tank like this, you can see that this one here, maybe, it's got little black fragments there on the bottom. That's the frass, that's the dropping. Sometimes you'll see little bits of leg from the prey or a wing down there. Those things in a humid enclosure will start to mold eventually. Now you can put a little coconut fiber in the bottom, and sometimes because coconut fiber has anti-mold properties, sometimes that will keep things from molding faster than in, you know, a bare bottom cup like this. But you know, if you start seeing mold grow, that's definitely time to clean the cup out or change it. I would recommend entirely changing the cup or washing it out with, you know, soap and warm water, and then rinsing it really, really well, of course. In a container like this with the coconut fiber on the bottom, you can, with a spoon, sort of, you know, scoop off the top layer. You know, if you have a limited amount of coconut fiber, you make it stretch. You know, spoon off the frass if you see it down there, if it's starting to mold or whatever. But you really should be removing the mold, because if the air does get foul in there, that's a sign of stagnation in the cup, and that's not healthy for the mantis. It could, you know, start to have some respiratory issues, you know, keeping things clean is really the best way to go. I don't tend to, once they're adults, I don't worry about it quite as much as when they're nymphs, because I'm not spraying the adults as frequently, and so the fallen bits of feeder insects down in the bottom and the frass aren't as likely to mold, because I'm not spraying it as frequently, and they're in larger terrariums, often with more ventilation. But in these closed up cups, it's a good idea to keep an eye on things and to, you know, keep things clean maybe once a week or so.
Okay. Now that sounds good. It sounds like it's like you say, it's more complicated in terms of frequency than some things like isopods, but it's really not too bad.
Yeah.
Pretty simple in general. Now, I wanted to backtrack to the feeding and ask a question. I know different mantis keepers differ on this topic. Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned, my wife is interested in orchid mantises, but she does not like me to get flies in the house. Mm-hmm. And so do you think it's feasible, since I raise my own crickets, I raise mealworms and so on, do you think it's feasible to raise an orchid mantis on things like mealworms, crickets, and so on? Well, fruit flies are okay. She'll allow me to raise fruit flies, and I have plenty of those, both
Mm-hmm.
Hydei and melanogaster. But mm-hmm. as far as house flies or, you know, things like that, she doesn't really want those in the house. So could I do it with just mealworms and crickets after they're too big for fruit flies?
Yeah. Yeah, lots of people do. Because you're raising your own crickets, you're probably less likely to succumb to what's called the brown goo of death, which is a not well understood but known phenomenon that comes from pet store crickets that are fed to pet mantises. There may be a bacterial infection or something is passed on to the mantises, and it causes them to vomit up this brown material in the tank. I see it happen sometimes also from other feeders. Not always sure where it comes from. It could also come maybe from, like I was talking about, stagnation earlier. So when you are feeding some of these other things and you get you know, a mantis vomiting, it's often hard to troubleshoot the cause of that. If you're feeding pet store crickets and your mantis does that, it's normally very easy to attribute it to the pet store crickets, because it's so well known in the hobby that that can occur. It doesn't, you know, a lot of people will raise their mantises entirely from, you know, if you can get pinhead crickets, like some people can at some pet stores, and then slightly larger ones along the way. Most pet stores only have medium and large crickets available. So, but there are people who raise their mantises entirely through just on what's available at the pet store, like the ones you mentioned. Better, of course, if you do breed your own, because you know they're going to be better kept, more well fed. You're feeding them a nutritious diet. You're keeping your bins clean. You're in control of the situation. So, yeah, you know, I would try it. I wouldn't worry too much about it. And you can always catch the stray moth at your porch light, like I said earlier too. You know,
right?
So,
yeah, that's encouraging. Then that's encouraging. I I've recently switched over to banded crickets too, which I think are easier to care for than the house crickets. But I've been raising crickets for my critters for years, and so I'm encouraged. I think we might give it a try then, because it's really nice when you have a significant other who actually wants what you're getting instead of
for sure
is just tolerating it. So
yeah, I was really happy when my my ex-wife got a bearded dragon, because then we had something in common. At least her pet was eating bugs, and it made going to reptile shows more fun and everything, because she had a reptile den. She'd go to see the reptiles, I'd go to see the bugs. And
right.
So I get what you're saying.
Yeah, well, that's very encouraging. Good. Well, before we go into breeding, because I do want to touch on that, I just wanted to give a shout out to our Patreon backers for making the channel what it is. Your help is really appreciated, and everyone who helps support the channel, that's great. And especially a big thanks to you, Peter, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here with you, Russ. It really is.
And I've been so excited about this, and I'm having a lot of fun too, so thank you. Well, let's talk about breeding then. You mentioned they're a little bit tougher than some other species of mantis.
So orchid mantises, is he still up here? Orchid mantises are perhaps, what do you say on your title? The best pet invertebrate?
Yes. Yeah.
They are probably the most sought after insect pet of all time. So definitely a good candidate for that title. One of the reasons that they're not more available is because they are quite difficult to breed. I've managed to do it a few times. If there's anybody out there that wants to get out of whatever career they're in and just do something with bugs, if you could breed orchid mantises, you'd be set for life. But unfortunately, if it were that easy, then the hobby would be filled with orchid mantises. There's only a few people that seem to be able to breed them with some consistency. And part of that, it's believed, might be due to inbreeding, which isn't usually a problem with any sort of pet arthropods, on average in the pet bug hobby anyway. But the orchid mantises, I have a couple examples here of an adult female and an adult male, but they're dead specimens. They are two specimens that I raised as pets and I bred at one time, but they ended up dying of natural causes. And just because I like to show people, sometimes I keep them in a bug freezer I have. And so would you like to see the dead specimens?
Sure, yes.
Some people may not like to see dead bugs, and of course they can look away if they want to. Let me pull these out here. And the reason I want to show these is because there's a strong sexual dimorphism in this species, a great contrast in size difference between the female here and the male. These are both adults, and I'll hold it up here a little bit closer. I have them in these Ziploc bags here. And this is an adult female here. At maturity, both the males and females gain their wings. And these males here are really, really great flyers. Of course, they fly around through the trees looking for females. The females, especially when they're filled up with eggs, they don't do much flying at all. And so, as many people already know, that mantises are sort of famous for the females eating the males. And when a male approaches a female, it's always taking a chance that it's going to be lunch, and instead of the father to her offspring. And so in this species, the size difference is so extreme that the males really fly well, and they have to be really sneaky to get up there on the back of her wings where they start out. And they try to stay out of reach. They'll go up there and place their forearms right around this portion right here, her collar, and just it's kind of like a safe spot for them, to where the female can't reach around and grab them. But at some point, depending, and they'll drum on her back like this. And that's a signal to her, you know, I'm here. I'm here to, you know, help you out, to be the father of your offspring, they're communicating back and forth. And often the females will be calling in nature, you know, that's how the males find them. They'll be putting pheromones out, and the males will detect them and fly to them. In captivity, we will sometimes see the female abdomen sort of swaying around a little bit when she's alone in her tank. And that's a sign. They'll sort of twist it out from underneath the wings sometimes. They'll also do that when they are pooping. So, if she's been mature for a few weeks or a couple months or something, and you are lucky enough to acquire a male who's mature at the same time, and you see the female doing that, that's a good time to put the male in. And it's a delicate time because mantises are predators, and the females are pretty much always hungry once they get up to a reproductive age like that. You want to be really careful when you put him in there, because she will make a snack of him if you're not careful. They do know what they're doing. They do know how to communicate, but she doesn't always know that this is the one and only male she's ever going to see in her life. So breeding is tricky in that way. Also, once the egg case is laid, a lot of people will have difficulty hatching the egg case out, even though it's really not that much different in terms of the care versus other hobby mantis egg cases. There's still a lot that can go wrong if you don't keep it warm enough and humid enough, and you're not consistent with those variables. If it's too humid, it can mold. If it's too dry, if it may or may not hatch. If it does hatch, they may, only some of them may come out, or they may come out halfway and get stuck, kind of like a mantis gets stuck in its molt. And so really probably the gateway or the bottleneck to them being more available in the hobby is the simple fact that they aren't very frequently available in the hobby. So there's not too many people working with them. And then, you'll sort of see cycles where they come in, and a lot of dealers have them, goes up and down, and then they'll disappear for a year and nobody will have them.
So it's sort of a boom and bust cycle going on with them that way.
Yeah. A lot of other mantises are easier to breed because, people will start out with larger groups of them, and they'll buy a group of 10 of them because they're really serious about breeding, like a Chinese mantis, for example, the Tenedera. And so they'll start out with 10, and then they'll have a lot more, and they're cheaper too, like the orchid mantises are one of the most expensive mantises. So when people do get them, not only do they have trouble buying as many as they might want to, but it's also cost prohibitive because they're so expensive. So a lot of people will get two, cross their fingers that they get a male and a female, but it's not always that easy, because if you acquire the same age ones, even if you acquire 5 of them, when they're all second instars, which means that they've shed their skin one time before since they came out of the egg case, the males will mature much more quickly than the females, which is kind of unusual for mantises also, how much more quickly the male orchid mantis matures versus the female. He could mature out in maybe 3 months, whereas, she might at room temperature take 5 months. It can be a difference in months, and the males are kind of short-lived. So the males will sometimes die before, the female that was purchased at the same time matures.
I've heard of some people trying to slow down the male's maturation by lower temperatures and smaller feedings or more infrequent feedings. Is that something that a lot of people do?
That's exactly what a lot of people end up having to do with this species right here. And in fact, I do it all the time. I will keep females that I get from one group, and then I will just cross my fingers that someone will come along a few months later with another group of them to sell, so I can get some males to breed with my females. It's also good for bloodlines reasons, to have different sources.
Deepen the gene pool a little bit, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about what sets the Orchid Mantis apart, you were talking about it is one of the best pet invertebrates, one of the most sought after. And we've talked about some of the pros of this species. What are some other pros that you would say about this particular species of mantis?
Well, really their beauty is, you know, first and foremost, the thing that everybody, so many people are familiar with them already. And I mean, it blends in with an orchid so amazingly well, even though, you know, that's more a myth than something that happens out in nature. They really aren't difficult to take care of. The breeding is the difficult part, but raising them from, you know, a first instar nymph, that's what they're called when they hatch out of the egg case. They molt one time, their second instar. Raising them up to maturity really isn't any more difficult than any other hobby mantis. You know, sometimes people will only buy one or two, and if they don't get them to maturity, they will assume that it's a difficult species versus, you know, when they bought 5 of another species and, you know, a few of them made it to maturity, but really they are quite easy to raise. So the beauty, the ease of care, the predatory habits, you know, I mean, you never get tired of watching a mantis, you know, a prey item coming closer to it, and it grabs that and pulls it to its face and, you know, just eats its face off. You just never get tired of watching that. You never do.
That's very true.
Your wife isn't getting tired of it because she doesn't want to see it in the first place, probably. But anybody who likes it once probably likes it forever.
I have to agree with you there. I never get tired of watching my invertebrates, or, well, any of my pets.
Yeah.
That's an amazing part of their behavioral repertoire to watch that.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. So I think it's got some great pros. Besides being kind of expensive, not always available, and a little difficult to breed, are there any other cons to this species?
Not really. I mean, the difficulty in acquiring them is the main one. Everything else, for me, I want every chance I get to purchase orchid mantises, I do. I mean, it doesn't matter, even though, you know, I normally acquire things at wholesale prices and I buy large groups of things. If I have an opportunity to buy them at a retail price, I still will, because, you know, I always want to breed my next batch of them. There's just so many other people that want that. And, you know, this male here, I'm not going to have a female for him. And so I'm going to send him off to someone who has a female, and I'll probably be asking somebody. And in fact, if one of your audience members has a female, I've got a subadult male here that I would be happy to send off to just for completely free to one of your viewers if they have a female to breed with him. He may become a snack, but he might sire the next generation as well.
Good. Well, that's good to keep in mind. So any of you who do happen to have a female, we can make that happen. That's very generous of you, Peter. And I hope we can get another generation from this one.
Yeah, I would love to see him go off to somebody. And it's not, I mean, believe it or not, it's not always easy to find someone who has a female of the right age here in the United States.
Yeah. Well, let's hope we can make it happen. I hope so. Well, I think this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter, for teaching us so much about the orchid mantis.
It's been a pleasure to share this specimen with you guys and to be on your channel. I would love to make another video with you sometime about any other kind of insect, Russ. I've had a good time. Oh,
let's do it. Definitely. I've got a lot of ideas for where we could go with that. So let's do it in the future. Well, so what do you think, everyone? Are orchid mantises the best pet invertebrate for you? If you'd like to check out my other videos in this playlist, I've got a whole playlist of other possible best pet invertebrates you can check out. And I post videos every Wednesday and Friday all on aquarium and vivarium pets. So please feel free to share, rate, comment on this video, and catch my next video. And thank you so much for watching.